can get. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin with kind of a little bit of a recap. We're in part 3 now of the series. And at this point tonight is the night where, with Erica's help, we make a little bit of a transition from just talking about the problem and how we got here, the underlying causes, to beginning to talk about what we can do differently. And then the final session next week, that will be our entire focus, what we can do differently. And we'll talk a little bit about, towards the end, the process for that, what we anticipate doing. I want to once again thank, first of all, Future Generations University. Oliver and Kelly Fleming, who you met earlier, are both employed there. They've been enormously helpful, not only with the tech, but on all the promotion and outreach. And this is in their bailiwick, because Future Generations is a university focused on social change to build a better world from a bottom-up perspective. Also very much want to thank our other two sponsors, Appalachian Voices and Like and Knowledge. As I've said before, both of them take somewhat different approaches, but both of them are also focused on bottom-up community development that comes from and works with the people in particular places to build stronger, better communities. So it's really great to have these three very appropriate sponsors. We would have gotten probably more money if we'd had sponsorships from Citibank and Dominion Energy, but I'm glad we've got these three. So we've talked about this a little bit along the way, but two quick things. Why should we care? Because that is a question that often comes up in this series. And one thing, this comes from David Wong. This is a terrific, really interesting article that's one of the ones in the Rural Urban Divide Guidebook called How Half of America Lost Its Effing Mind. But he said it feels good, and this was written in 2016, by the way, it feels good to dismiss people, to mock them, to write them off as deplorables, but you might as well take time to try to understand them, because I'm telling you, they'll still be around long after Trump is gone. And this is from an Asian American man, grew up in a very rural, mostly white community. And he's, again, I highly recommend that article, but that's the truth of it. And he was quite right to say that people have not suddenly changed their perspective just because Trump is no longer president. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that whatever our frustrations about the divide, about the differences in perspective, about the fact that we seem to have 2 or 3 or 4 sets of truths, the fact of the matter is that ultimately all of us, whether we're in suburbs, cities, or the countryside, are dependent on well-managed, highly functioning rural places for farms and forests and fisheries and all the ecological services. We need the stuff that rural places alone can provide in abundance. So without healthy rural economies and communities, really, we're all in jeopardy. So we have a lot of self-interest, even if we ourselves are not part of those communities. Very quickly, there have been some good, well, first of all, I'll say terrific comments and questions during the sessions, but also a few folks have entered in the Padlet. And here's 3 that came through either the Padlet or the chat box since last time. I don't really have answers for these, but some interesting questions. One person said that she lived in the suburbs, which often gets lumped together with the cities. She said that's really not the same, and asked, is it possible that the people in the suburbs might play something of a mediating role between urban and rural? And I don't have an answer for that, but that's certainly an interesting thought. And as many suburbs have become more diverse, racially and otherwise, it might be actually quite an interesting little lab of opportunity to try to experiment with overcoming the divide. Another kind of a line of discussion was around what would it take to build solidarity between people in the city and people in the country, with some suggestions that maybe a bunch of people from the city need to move to the country, other people with caveats that if people come from outside with a lot more resources and a different kind of ethic and education, which often they do, that might create its own problems. But I guess for me, the real question here is, isn't there an alternative? I'm going to suggest that I think there is an alternative to simply being in the same place as our only hope of building understanding and trust. I think there's other ways to do that, although that's certainly one. And then one person had a very interesting thought that a potential outcome from the series might be that several of you are motivated to write articles, whether it's in your local papers, a magazine, online, some blog that you're connected with, about this series, about this issue, and about anything that you've picked up from it. So that idea of individual or co-authored articles coming from the participants, I think is a fabulous idea, and I hope some of you will take that and run with it. So over the first 2 sessions, we have gone through these 6 underlying causes, beginning with an economy that has failed most Americans and been particularly degrading, even destructive to so many rural economies and communities. And that this has formed the foundation, along with a lot of other factors, to generate this very widespread anger towards elites, with elites usually being defined as liberals, urbanites, academics, as Kathy Kramer told us, government employees, public employees, Democrats, et cetera. Also a strong anti-government, or at least skepticism of government, particularly around regulations, what I've called regulatory aversion, because folks feel that the government is usually ineffective and very intrusive and doesn't really help the little guy with their regulations. The fourth cause being what Arlie Hochschild called people feeling like strangers in their own land. We talked quite a bit about that last time, this sense of being displaced, being kind of kicked out of your place in line, and that not only among white rural people, but among many people of color, just a sense of complete disenchantment with politics, that it's meaningless and pointless to engage in. A fifth cause being with the two-party system we have, that this fundamental shift in the Democratic Party and its orientation. You've had these two parties that have morphed over the years quite a bit, but the Democratic Party being historically the party of the working class, with its shift away, both in its policies, but also in its language. And Erica's going to talk not just about the Democratic Party, but sort of liberal language. And the last thing is this element that, as we've always seemed to, particularly in presidential years, strive for some sort of moderate middle ground, that part of the problem with that has been that the resulting policy proposals and often actual political process is driven by a notion that incrementalism is the only thing we can do, and it's the wisest course if we want to win over the most people. But the problem with that is that incremental change might work for people who are doing just fine and only need a couple of tweaks, but for people who are in a really bad way economically and otherwise, incrementalism is really quite an insult and obviously a terribly inadequate response to their situation. So as we begin to shift from how did we get here to what do we do about it, I'm going to suggest that today and next week, we think of that movement forward in 3 ways: thinking differently, acting differently, and talking differently. Now, tonight with Erica, we're going to be especially focused on the third one, and you're going to just really, I think, enjoy and get a lot from Erica's presentation. But before we get into the communication element, starting with thinking differently, I want to make sure that all of us start with the recognition that many rural people believe that the economy and the government have failed them utterly, and that the wider liberal culture completely disrespects them, and that basically they're right. I mean, you could argue that around the edges of it, but basically those beliefs are right. So whatever frustrations I know some people have expressed, why do we have to extend understanding to them? Why don't they extend understanding to us? Why don't they want to learn where we're coming from? All of that is fair enough in some theoretical world, but where we're at right now is an awful lot of rural people feel the way I've said here. And so really we have to take that as the starting point. Of course, the guidebook that we've talked about many times, that's been in the chat box that you can get, is our best effort so far at giving you a kind of one-stop shop for thinking and understanding how we got here and what we do about it. as a starting place. I also want to emphasize a couple things that we'll probably talk about a little bit more in the final session. One area of tremendous divide consistently and often really intense is around the environment, climate change, and environmental regulation more generally. And this thinking differently, I'm going to suggest, around the environment also includes that for many liberal people, especially from the suburbs and urban areas, the environmental movement often is about how do we protect the land? How do we keep people from harming the land or further destroying the land? That's been kind of the dominant approach. But in many rural communities, there is a definite land ethic, but it's more uh, about livelihood. How do we care for the land in such a way that we get what we need from it? And so for many working people, rural people, excuse me, whether they're farmers or not, the idea of protecting the land really means working the land well. So that's just a fundamentally
Are you
different way of
eating plain
thinking
yogurt?
about an
Ah, I
environmental
see.
perspective. Um, Another way to think differently is looking for opportunities where, when we put on our policy hats, where we can incentivize rather than penalize. Because again, one of the dominant feelings among many rural people, especially farmers and working folks, is that they're always being told what to do. Um, they're always being sort of managed and monitored. But what if we incentivize? What if the Dodd-Frank bill, if we worked on rewriting, was stronger on the biggest banks, but understood that community banks, which do most of the lending to small businesses in small towns and rural places, they can't handle the same burden that the big Wall Street banks can. So what if we incentivize small banks into lending more rather than penalizing them for really the mistakes of the Wall Street banks? What if we incentivize farmers who are doing multi-species grazing and through both federal and state policy, and this is beginning to happen, were to reward them for practices that sequester carbon in the soils of their pastures and grasslands, rather than penalizing them for mistakes? What if we worked with farmers like Chris Noble in Western New York State, who has taken a fairly large dairy operation, worked with restaurants and institutions like schools and colleges and universities, and built a series of anaerobic digesters where he turns his own waste and the waste of thousands upon thousands of consumers in the city into an anaerobic compost. He gets methane for heating his buildings and running some of his electrical needs. And he then has a very high quality soil amendment that can be applied to his land and other farmland. What if we think more about incentives than penalties? The second area before we get to the language is this idea of acting differently. And this can be at multiple levels. And again, I hope next week we'll talk a little bit about different kinds of policies and different kinds of actions at a larger level. But we've begun discussing, several of us who've been through some of these series, the idea of what about liberal groups joining forces, liberal and progressive organizations joining forces with churches and civic groups and business associations to do good work in the community. And what if that started to happen as a regular way of doing business among them, whether it's a local Democratic committee or political organization, or whether it's a social justice and peace group or anything else like that. So you can imagine things like working with local businesses and farmers to start a buy local campaign. One of the comments in the chat box was from Melinda Fleming. I don't know if Melinda's with us tonight, but she talked about how activists in Oregon are working to make sure that some of the federal dollars in the American Rescue Plan Act, which passed early this year in the Biden administration, goes to real concrete improvements in rural communities. And her plan, or the plan of the folks there, is to work on specific projects that address real needs and demonstrate to rural people that they're not being abandoned. So this, along with good messaging, they're hoping will have concrete results and also begin to change people's perspective. That's exactly what many of us who've been involved with the rural-urban divide are calling a community works strategy for actually beginning to change hearts and minds while doing good work. And another one that's become not common, but is springing up in places like West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and elsewhere, is working with local farmers, working with local clinics and healthcare providers to either start or augment pharmacy initiatives where healthcare providers are writing prescriptions, literally writing prescriptions for local produce, helping farmers, helping lower income people eat better. These are just a few samples of the kinds of possibilities that acting differently could mean. So then for the balance of this evening, before we shift to our Q&A, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Erica Edelson. I've been getting to know Erica over the last 6 months. She's a bright light. She's a tremendous collaborator, and she's a brilliant woman who has really gone deep on this question of language and how language can be either alienating or opening. So Erica, I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to you to go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Anthony, and greetings everyone from sunny California. Let me just take a minute here to get my screen share going. Okay, are we seeing what we should be seeing?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I've actually been lurking in the shadows during the past 2 sessions and really enjoying what's been presented and the discussion. And so I think that what I'm going to present tonight will dovetail with what you've been talking about in the past sessions. Anthony has talked the last couple times about how over the past 40 years or so, liberals and Democrats have come to be more oriented toward highly educated, urban, upper middle class and upper class professionals. And what I'm going to do tonight is talk about how this kind of growing elitist orientation shows up in the way that liberals talk about rural America, or as the Washington Post calls it, the country's dank backwaters. What I see happening, not across the board with all liberals, but often enough to be a problem, is that liberals sometimes talk down to people who don't have the same outlook that they do. They tend to lecture and scold and not do much listening or empathizing. And let me say that when I say they, I am including myself in that. I would say we, except I don't want to implicate anyone on this call who's not responsible, but I have been just as much a part of the problem as anyone. I want to own that. I think that one of the reasons that they/we do this is because we have 3 sets of assumptions and stereotypes that kind of overlap and get intermingled. So the first on the bottom right here is that conservatives are conspiracy-minded bigots who don't care about anyone besides themselves. The second set of assumptions is that working people are so gullible and stupid that they vote against their own interests for con artists like Trump. And the third is that rural people are stupid, white, conservative, racist, rednecks. And if they're suffering, then they have only themselves and their backwards ways to blame. So what I'm going to do next is show you all a few examples of what I'm talking about, of how liberal disdain gets expressed in the media and in popular culture. The first example I'm going to show is a clip from CNN. And this comes from, you might remember a few years ago, there was this kerfuffle where Mike Pompeo didn't want to answer the NPR reporter's questions about the Ukraine, because it was like during the impeachment and he didn't want to talk about Ukraine, and he told her, oh, you wouldn't even know how to find Ukraine on a map. And anyway, she could, that doesn't really matter. But this is how CNN chose to cover that incident.
University.
Right.
Also, he doesn't really say that she couldn't identify Ukraine on a map. He insinuates it's just a petty attempt to put her down, right? Is that what this is?
Of course. Of course, he's just trying to demean her, and obviously it's false. And look, he also knows deep in his heart that Donald Trump couldn't find Ukraine on a map if you had the letter U and a picture of an actual physical crane next to it. He knows that this is, you know, an administration defined by ignorance of the world. And so that's partly him playing to their base and playing to their audience, you know, the credulous boomer Rube demo that backs Donald Trump, that wants to think that Donald Trump's a smart one and y'all elitists are dumb.
You elitists with your geography and your maps and your spelling. Even though my
your math and your reading.
Yeah, you're reading, you know, your geography, knowing other countries, sipping your latte.
All those lines on the map.
Only them elitists know where Ukraine is. Sorry, I apologize. But
Ukraine? Oh my God.
But you know what? But it was Rick's fault. I blame Rick. But you know, but in all honesty, blame
Rick.
NPR should
Why
do.
not? Sorry, hold on. Wait.
Can I tell you
Give me
what?
a second. Hold on. That was good. Sorry, Rick. That was a good one. I needed that. Okay, so listen.
Okay, so yeah, ha ha ha. Basically what CNN is saying here is that people who talk with a Southern accent are stupid and ignorant. And so they deserve to be treated as a punchline in a news story that's supposed to be about Mike Pompeo. And the other thing CNN did was they insulted Trump's intelligence, which is really one of the media's favorite things to do. Not just during the Trump presidency, but going all the way back to Bush and Reagan. For those of you who are old enough to remember, that was a big theme, mocking Reagan's and Bush Jr.'s intelligence as well. And the problem with doing that is that it makes those politicians look like victims in the eyes of people who relate to having their intelligence insulted by the same people. And then that prompts them to form a bond with those politicians that's rooted in their collective sense of victimhood. Another example I want to show you is from this Taylor Swift video. It's a music video. Unfortunately, we don't have time to watch it, which would be fun. But I've got some screenshots to give you the gist of it. The video starts with Taylor Swift there in the pool with a decrepit trailer home on fire in the background. We don't know yet what that trailer home is supposed to symbolize, but it will become clear later. Sorry, there we go. So then there's a bunch of really fun, high energy, upbeat scenes where these very beautiful, glamorous LGBTQ people are having a wonderful time. They're celebrating, they're dancing, they're having pride, and it's all good and wonderful. But then the toothless hillbillies show up with their hateful, misspelled signs and ruin everything. So I would call this a shaming ritual, where someone like Taylor Swift, who has a lot of cultural power, is punishing people who she thinks aren't as woke as she thinks that she is. And she's punishing them with shame, which is a very powerful emotion, and it makes people feel pretty awful. Every single researcher I've come across who studies hate groups says that the people who join those groups are drowning in feelings of shame and humiliation. And so they join the groups as a way to try to regain their self-esteem. So I really think that using shame as a political weapon is a very dangerous tactic. I'm going to run through the rest of these slides with more examples, but without any commentary, because I think they really speak for themselves. And as you're watching these, see if you can just try and like put yourself in the shoes of people who are being portrayed here, or who are on the receiving end of this kind of contempt, and just kind of try and feel what it feels like. And I'll ask you afterwards if you want to share any reactions that you have. Okay, so if anyone wants to just type into chat, just like 1 or 2 words of your reaction, of like how you felt, or how you imagine someone might feel seeing this and thinking that, hey, they're talking about me and my community here. And then maybe I'll ask Oliver, because I can't see the chat right now, to just maybe read a few of those things out.
I see rage and dehumanizing, sad, lack of civility, angry, unproductive, hateful, dismissive, deep shame, outraged, unheard. They don't know what we've gone through.
Mhm.
Need to
Yeah.
feel superior.
That's, yeah, that last one is particularly important, because so the name of my book is Beyond Contempt. And the reason I focused on contempt is because I think it incorporates that superiority issue, because contempt is a blend of anger and superiority and disgust. And so while anger itself is something that, can be productive or counterproductive, kind of depending on how it's used in the political arena, contempt, because of that superiority component, really is incredibly damaging and counterproductive, as someone else noted. So what happens when people are treated with this kind of contempt is that, as people noted in the chat, they feel shame and anger, and they get defensive. Being verbally attacked triggers the same fight or flight reflex in our minds that being physically attacked does. So the brain just becomes preoccupied with protecting the person from getting hurt. And then the higher levels of the brain that are responsible for, empathy and reason and logic, those just shut down. They don't function. And so no learning is possible at that point. The chance of someone changing their mind when they're in such a defensive state of mind is 0. And it's even less than 0, because they're probably going to double down and entrench themselves in their pre-existing opinion, because they're probably thinking to themselves, how can anyone who is acting like such a know-it-all jerk possibly be right? And if they are right, I am sure as hell not going to admit it. So this is what defensive looks like. And Trump knows this. This right here is the demagogue playbook. Demagogues feed off of hatred of elites. They stir up the hatred against a common enemy, whether it's the media, libtards, whoever it is that's dissing them. And then the demagogue's role is to retaliate and defend and restore the people's honor. When the people see a demagogue like Trump knock self-righteous liberals off their high horse, it takes the sting out of the shame that they're feeling. There's an article just this month in the magazine The Atlantic, where an Ohio steel worker who was the president of his local union tells the reporter that he found Trump's insults exhilarating because they were like a kind of revenge. And he said, it's a mirror of the way they see us. I also want to show you a comment I came across from a New York Times reader a couple of years ago that I think pretty well captures what a lot of people who aren't part of the ultra progressive left are feeling. I am an old FDR Democrat. I am reasonably coherent, respectful, and articulate. But whenever I try to talk politics with my progressive friends and relatives, I'm met with a sneering laugh, openly derisive and dismissive of anyone so stupid that they do not see the virtue of unlimited illegal immigration, questions the recent orthodoxy that there is no such thing as male and female, or tries to explain that condescending contempt is a poor way to garner votes. These are highly educated people. One is a senior professor of sociology, another a Pulitzer-winning author, another a distinguished lawyer. The laugh is always the same, as if they practice it together, a nearly hysterical giggle of embarrassment that anyone could be so stupid. I am made to feel as if I am mentally deficient, and they can't wait to change the subject, to end the embarrassment of being in the presence of a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal. Just imagine how a conservative reacts to this treatment. Well, we don't have to imagine how a conservative reacts. We know. They have told us that the contempt that they feel from liberal elites antagonizes them and makes them hate us right back. They have told us again and again that they are moving to the right in reaction to what they see as intolerance and self-righteousness on the left. And let's talk a little bit about swing voters, because that's obviously of utmost importance in any election. Swing voters have told us that they feel judged by liberals and feel more welcomed by the Republican Party. I'm going to show you a quote from a rural Iowa school teacher named Brittany Bartz, who was asked why she thought that voters in Iowa swung from Obama to Trump. She said, I think maybe part of it is we feel like liberals are telling us that if you don't believe in abortion, that you hate women. And if you like guns, then you just want kids in school killed. And so I think a lot of people felt almost attacked for beliefs that they have. And so people on the fence, like myself, that could go either way a lot of times, feel that a lot of times liberals think that they're the moral ones and they're right. It's like if you have a stance on certain issues, that you can't be a part of us because you're so wrong on this issue. The Republican Party is maybe a little more accepting. You can be part of the Republican Party, but disagree with us on certain issues. Whereas I feel like liberals or the Democrat Party, you have to believe these things or you're a bad person. So I see this habit of treating conservatives and moderates with contempt as a huge unforced error for the left that has cost us more supporters than it has gained us, and is really fueling the polarization that keeps rural and urban America divided and keeps rural voters still wanting someone like Trump to restore their honor. So we're going to segue into solutions. What's the solution? What's the alternative to being condescending and snide and snarky and dismissive and all the things that we just see 24/7? If we're not going to try to knock it into their stupid little minds that MAGA is a giant fraud, how else can we share our opinions about the issues that we feel like are just so important, existentially important? In my book, I go into a lot of detail about a communication technique called powerful non-defensive communication. This is a method that was developed by this really brilliant woman named Sharon Strand Ellison. And she has used it and taught it to politicians and progressive groups to use in their campaigns. And it's been really effective. I don't have time to go into like a real kind of training around what powerful non-defensive communication is, but here is the short version. As soon as this wakes up, here we go. Thich Nhat Hanh, if you don't know him, is a Buddhist monk and an anti-war activist going back to the Vietnam War era. So this is his wisdom: speak the truth, but not to punish. And that's like my whole book in 7 words. We can say whatever we want to say. And as long as we do it straightforwardly, without judging or mocking or browbeating the other person, and without dehumanizing them and tearing down their humanity, then there's a chance that they will hear what we're saying instead of just rejecting it out of hand because we've made them feel defensive. And so I think that if we can do that more consistently, then there's at least the possibility that we can go from this to this. And I'm going to pause here.
Erica,
Wait for Anthony to come back on. Okay.
Sure, I'm on. If you'll stop sharing your screen,
Oh, yes, indeed.
that'd be great. Terrific. So we're going to now segue into talking about what you've heard from Erica, everything you've heard tonight, and also to look at what we can do about it, and then be totally preoccupied with that next week. Erica, that was a fabulous presentation. It's really, really very helpful. She asked me to start the conversation by relating a story I've already related to you, which she's then going to kind of assess my response and maybe suggest an alternative. So last time, I believe, I mentioned to you about being at a campaign event in 2018 in rural Southwest Virginia, a little house party, and having a middle-aged woman who was a owner of a retail store invite me over after the presentation, and she said to me, if you get elected, there's just one thing I want from you: leave me alone. And I talked about how after she said that, we were chatting about what that meant and how I felt about it as a farmer, and then how an adjacent conversation with some of her neighbors brought up a service station in their community that was leaking petroleum into the groundwater and into the local creek, and everybody was in an uproar about that situation. And the woman who had said to me, just leave me alone, then said to the group, somebody's got to stop that guy. Somebody's got to do something about that. And at that point, I said, but don't you just think he wanted to be left alone? He wants to be left alone. So, Erica?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks, Anthony, for being a really good sport and letting me critique this a little bit. I mean, I have the benefit now of 4 years of hindsight and plenty of time to think about how to do things differently. And it can be hard. It can be really challenging in the moment. And, I think like you had a witty comeback that maybe a lot of us would have been like pretty happy, pat ourselves on the back, like, oh yeah, gotcha. I got a good dig in on her. But the problem with what you said is that it ridiculed her position. So it was kind of like saying, look at how absurd your libertarian extremism is, and look what a hypocrite you are. Now you're saying, first you said you want the government to leave you alone, and now you want the government to deal with this gas station. So she may have or probably went away feeling like some combination of shame, anger, humiliation, and resentment at having, at that response. So what could Anthony have done instead? So the first piece of powerful non-defensive communication, really kind of the cornerstone of the whole method, is curiosity. Because when we get curious about where someone's coming from, it takes us out of our judgmental mind, and it gets that other part of our brain activated, where we more have like a childlike, like an innocent curiosity, and just, really like an openness to hearing them and understanding. So when we hear someone say something that we don't like, or that we disagree with, or we know is just wrong, instead of racing in to tell them all the reasons they're wrong, it starts with asking ourselves, what do I want to understand better about where this person's coming from? And then when we've answered that for ourselves, we turn that around and start asking them questions. And these are questions that are truly curious, not leading, not argumentative, not entrapping. The best kind of question is one that really like draws out the person's story, their life experiences that have led them to honestly have these beliefs that they have. So let me go back into my screen share here for a second. Sorry, I'm a little laggy here. Okay, can y'all see that? Anthony?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is what she said, just leave me alone. So at that point, these are a couple questions that occurred to me that he might have asked. He could have asked, did you have a bad experience with government meddling that makes you feel that way? Okay, so that's probably going to elicit a story from her about a bad experience that she had, and she'll be happy to tell that story. Another question is, are there any government regulations you're okay with, or are you against all of them? And this is a kind of question that I like to use often, because I think it's easy to assume when someone says something, especially something kind of flippant, it's easy to assume that they are taking the most extreme position imaginable. And when you give them a chance to kind of moderate their position, they will often take that chance and like realize themselves, or be like, oh, no, here's what I really think. So already then you've like made a little progress then, and are less mad or baffled by them once they've moderated their view. Okay, so he asked that question, and then let's say she then proceeds to tell him her government bureaucracy horror story. At that point, Anthony can then make a statement that begins with not showing that he heard what she had to say. Secondly, agreeing to the extent possible, and that it's not always possible, but if there is anything to agree with, that's good to do at the beginning. And then after all that, then he can state his position. So this is kind of what I came up with that he might have said. Whoops, sorry, let me go back. It sounds like you had a bad experience with some rules that seemed silly to you. I think it's probably true that some of the rules don't make sense and can be hard on small business owners. Where I would draw the line is when it comes to laws that keep us safe, like banning lead paint after we found out it was causing brain damage to little kids. And then I inserted there, like if Anthony at that point had a personal story having something to do with lead paint or whatever example he was giving there, his own story that, where he could show why it's really important to him to have regulations that protect people. It's always great to throw in a personal story. It makes everything you say so much more relatable and much harder to argue with, because it's just your story versus, a bunch of facts and statistics. And then it goes on. So I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If I do go to Washington, What I want to do is make sure the bureaucrats in DC hear from regular people like you. I assume they're trying to do a good job, but sometimes just don't have all the local knowledge they need to do their job right. Okay. And then last piece here is later on when the gas station story came up and she said, somebody's got to get that guy to stop that. So option one, we talked about, that's the gotcha. We talked about why that's going to be counterproductive. And the alternative would just be a really simple statement. This gas station situation to me is an example of where the government should be stepping in and making sure it gets cleaned up so that we have safe drinking water. Yeah, so that's it for that example. I'm going to stop my share now.
Thanks, Erica. So that's I think that really beginning to get at some of the questions I saw in the chat box. And Oliver, where we have about 10, 12 minutes left, if you'll kind of grab some out, as definitely some responding to what Erica's already said, adding dimensions, affirming them, but why don't you grab a couple of questions from our participants?
Sure. Yeah. The first one I see is from Alexandra. It says it's acknowledging the powerful non-defensive communication and how that could improve interpersonal relationships. The question is, how could that then scale up into policy?
I mean, I don't think it's like a linear thing unless the person you're having a conversation with is, you know, a decision maker, like your member of Congress. You could certainly put the skills to use there. But I think it's also, it can be useful for people like writing letters to the editor or, you know, posting things on social media. The more you can stay non-defensive and state your views, then, you know, the more it's possible people will agree with you and then ultimately potentially, you know, change who they would vote for as a result. So it's not like a direct cause and effect, but it's just sort of part of shifting the center of gravity of our politics.
And I'd add that it's also a long-term process. One of the polls that I quoted in either the first or second session, it wasn't a poll, it was a series of focus groups with conservatives that were done just this past spring, made it very clear that sometimes the same idea essentially that is welcomed by working class folks or rural people or conservatives, if it has a Democratic label or a liberal label attached to it, it's responded to almost exactly the opposite, from high approval to low approval. What that means is that the brand of liberals, Democrats, progressives is so bad, is so toxic, that people will look beyond the particulars of the issue and make that association and basically say, if it's coming from that kind of crowd, I want nothing from it. As I think many of us would do from a proposal that would come from a Donald Trump or a, whomever from the other side. And so I think that we have to recognize that what we're really trying to do is change the foundation of the way people perceive one another. And that in the long run would enable better discussions about policy and maybe better policies too.
I see along those lines from Rosie, there's a question about, so shame, anger, and embarrassment and resentment are the negative emotions that we want to avoid in our communication. Erica, can you help us pinpoint the positive emotions that would be more helpful to elicit?
Yeah, I think the opposite of those things are connection and caring, empathy. Not necessarily in a, in a super touchy-feely way, but just showing people that, you've heard them, you care about them. Your goal isn't to try and score political points for your team or to convince them of anything, but that you're just another person trying to figure this out so that our community works better for everyone.
Also in the chat from Steven, there's really good advice from him as a sociocultural anthropologist. So I'd encourage everybody to go read that. I'm not going to read it out, but that's really good feedback, Stephen. I'm also seeing a question from Lisa. It says, I believe what you're saying is true. One thing I wonder, though, is if rural people feel that urban elites are condescending towards them, is there any sign that rural people are still interested in dialogue and understanding the other side? And in other words, what incentive would rural people have to do to mirror the image of what we are doing? Trying to understand how to come back together. Are there any parallel efforts from the rural side here? Or is it just the liberal side trying to understand why rural people hate them and don't vote the same way?
Erica, I wanted to comment a little bit from a kind of a community level. I wonder if you might talk a bit about some of the groups you know that are doing that, where it's a two-way street instead of one. But one thing I want to say, since my work, my day job, besides farming, is rural development, community development, I actually see that quite a bit. It's plays out in a different way where people who I know to be on the other side politically, oftentimes maybe religiously based conservatives or otherwise very strong conservatives, many of them, not all by any means, but many of them are actually eager to work with liberal people around solving community problems and have been doing that for quite some time. And even in this time of just heightened kind of anger and polarization, there's still lots of local people who will get on board with people that will work with them to better the community. So you begin there to see it's not that they're extending themselves and saying, hey, I want to understand why you hold progressive political views. That's not necessarily happening. But there is this sense of, what do you think our community needs to do since we've lost X, Y, or Z as our main industries? How can we rekindle them? And so it takes a certain degree of openness, a certain degree of setting aside the way it's always been done in order to take ideas from others, and whether those others are lifelong local residents or whether they're people who've moved to the area. So I do see it playing out a lot in the community development realm, more of a two-way street.
Yeah, and then in a very different way, there are quite a few dialogue initiatives that really started blossoming right after the 2016 election, when people were like, oh my God, this polarization is so awful, what can we do? The one I'm most familiar with is Braver Angels, and they have a whole series of programs where you can get together in either a group setting or a one-on-one setting and have dialogue across lines of difference. And they are all, but they have a strict rule that it has to be like 3 conservatives and 3 liberals, or an equal number. So you absolutely can find them there and talk to them. And there's even a new thing where they're doing one-on-one with rural and urban. So I encourage you to check out Braver Angels and getting involved in some of their workshops.
Stephen asks about jargon and whether not using so much jargon could help some of those conversations.
Absolutely. I'll let Erica comment too, but when I don't have Erica joining me on these seminars, that's one of my 4 principles of good communication in small towns and rural communities, is avoid jargon. And I can tell you that the liberal world, which includes lots of kind of nonprofit and foundation and academic people and social activists, we are just so enamored of jargon, so prone to find new ways of saying something that we used to say fairly simply, and I think that jargon shuts people down, and I think that it creates a sort of expert versus ordinary person dynamic that just goes right to the heart of the problem. So yes, let's stop using the damn talking points and jargon. I say talk to people as a neighbor, not as an activist or an advocate. Go ahead, Erica.
Ditto. Everything I learned about how destructive jargon is, I learned from Anthony. And I have an article coming out next week in Yes Magazine on this exact topic. So you can keep your eyes out for that.
I'm not seeing a ton of more questions. I'm seeing lots of affirmations of points that you all have made and points that other people have made in the chat. There's really good conversations happening, resources being shared. So it sounds like a lot of us are very ready to move towards action, which is great. I want to suggest I'm posting the Padlet link again and a help video for how to use Padlet. I would suggest if you have a resource, there's lots of resources being exchanged, please add that to the Padlet. Because I think a lot of us, we go to these things, we see a resource that somebody suggests, and then it disappears forever from the comments when we leave. So I just added a column in that Padlet for resources. So if you have a suggestion, please add that there. I've been trying to drop some of the ones that have been mentioned in the chat as well. And I will go through and add those myself.
Thanks, Oliver. So we're going to wrap up tonight. Again, next week, we will start right into conversations about what we can do differently. And the plan is we're generally been a group the last couple of times around 45 to 50 people. So after a really brief, I promise, very brief recap from me about this think differently, act differently, talk differently, my suggestion is that we break into 3 rooms with people who are interested in working on one of those 3 areas. So if your focus is really around communication and how to do it better, how to avoid the contempt and open doors, then you would go to the talk differently group. If you're somebody who wants to focus in on community works or actually changing public policy around rural and rural urban, then you'd go to the act differently. And if you are still sort of wanting to dive into understanding, if you want to find additional resources, if you want to set up book groups to read Erica's book or Kathy's book, or you want to otherwise engage still at the level of diving in, you might go into the Think Differently group. That's the plan. I hope it works. But we will spend most of the time in those small groups. We'll come back together towards the end of the hour to just check in. There have been suggestions about how to keep interest and energy going forward. Again, as Oliver said, using the Padlet to suggest resources. Somebody, for instance, in the chat just mentioned Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, as a terrific resource for that do a great job on not only rural issues, but language and communication in a multimedia sort of way. And there's other terrific groups around that, Daily Yonder and the Center for Rural Affairs and others. So in any event, that's the plan for next week. Really appreciate the great conversation. And once again, a thanks